Good morning, students. Today we are going to continue with the same chapter, Mother's Day, that we were reading in the last class also. Mother's Day is written by J.B. Priestley. It is from your book Snapshot. This is page number 35 that we were reading. And till now we have read that this is a very gripping story. This is a very interesting story about the pathetic condition, about the bad treatment, ill treatment that a woman faces in her own household, how she is actually, you can say, treated as a servant in the house. Nobody pays attention to her, nobody is interested in taking her out with them in their parties, or she was actually not given any kind of advantage plus any kind of, you can say, regard or respect in her own house. And this is a story about Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson. Actually, Mrs. Pearson is the lady of the house, and she had a neighbor whose name is Mrs. Fitzgerald. And Mrs. Fitzgerald is again and again asking Mrs. Pearson to be strong. She wanted her to be strict. She wanted her to teach a lesson to her husband and to the children also, because if she wanted her rights back, she had to put her foot down. According to her, according to Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson should behave like the head of the house, head of the family, mistress or boss of the family, and for that reason she had to be firm and strict in her ways. But Mrs. Pearson is actually not a kind of lady who could do all these things, and she was really flustered. She is always, you can say, in a shy position. She is nervous, she is confused, she is always doubtful, suspicious. She did not know how to handle these kind of situations. And at last Mrs. Fitzgerald actually offered her to exchange their places, and now she was asking her to maybe exchange their bodies or souls. So we were reading here, Mrs. Pearson, last line, dubiously, well, I don't know, is it right? Means when Mrs. Fitzgerald said that they could change their places, they could change their bodies, their souls, their physiques, Mrs. Pearson was really doubtful at that time also. Dubious means doubtful. And she said, I don't know, is it right? Means whether it was correct or not. This is page number 36 now. Mrs. Fitzgerald, it's your only chance. Give me your hands and keep quiet a minute. Just don't think about anything. Taking her hands, now look at me. They stare at each other, muttering, Arshtat dam, Arshtat lumber dam bona, lam dam bona. Now this was actually some chanting that was done by Mrs. Fitzgerald, and she muttered. Muttered means in a low voice she actually spoke all these words. And why? Because she wanted to exchange their bodies. They had to go through a process. And Mrs. Fitzgerald gave the instructions that it was the only chance that Mrs. Pearson would get, and for a minute, for a quite a minute, they had to be very quiet, they had to be very silent, and they took each other's hands in the hands of each other, and she started muttering these words. This little scene should be acted very carefully. We are to assume that the personalities change bodies. After the spell has been spoken, both women, still grasping hands, go lax. What is the meaning of lax? Lax means they would get relaxed. They would you can say they would feel very loose, as if the life were out of them. Now what actually happened when this scene would be acted? If it would be acted on the stage, the two personalities, the two characters who would be playing the role of Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson, they should, you can say, not speak anything after that. And after this spell, they should become very loose, they should become very flexible, and they should lose their energy. Then both come to life, but with the personality of each other. But when they would come back to their senses, they would have the personalities of each other. Mrs. Fitzgerald would become Mrs. Pearson, and Mrs. Pearson would become Mrs. Fitzgerald. Each must try to adopt the voice and mannerism of the other. And this is very important because now Mrs. Fitzgerald would become Mrs. Pearson. So she would be dubious, she would be nervous, she would have that fluttering tone. On the other hand, Mrs. Pearson, she would become bold and dominating. So this is very important. Each must try to adopt the voice and the mannerism also of each other. So now Mrs. Pearson is bold. This is very important. Mrs. Pearson is bold now and dominating, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is nervous and fluttering. So what actually happened now? Mrs. Pearson said, now with Mrs. Fitzgerald's personality. See what I mean, dear? She notices the cigarette. Here, you don't want that. She snatches it and puts it in her mouth, puffing contentedly. Contentedly means satisfactorily. So what actually happened now? Mrs. Pearson noticed that everything was done well, but actually Mrs. Pearson here means Mrs. Fitzgerald, because Mrs. Pearson's body had got the soul of Mrs. Fitzgerald. So now Mrs. Pearson said, now you don't want this cigarette, and she actually took it from the mouth of Mrs. Fitzgerald and she started you can say puffing it. She started smoking. Mrs. Fitzgerald now with Mrs. Pearson's personality. This is very important. Whenever now Mrs. Fitzgerald would be speaking something, she actually had got the personality of Mrs. Pearson. Looks down at herself and sees that her body had changed and gives a scream of fright. Means Mrs. Fitzgerald, who had got Mrs. Pearson's personality, she actually you can say had a scream. Scream means she started crying. Crying here means she was shouting with happiness. And she said, Mrs. Fitzgerald said, with Mrs. Pearson's person, means she was actually, why she was crying? Because she was, you can say, afraid. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, she said, oh, it has happened. Mrs. Pearson said, complacently. Now, complacently means in a very cool way, because Mrs. Pearson had got the soul of Mrs. Fitzgerald, and she is a very casual looking lady. She is very bold, very strong. Of course, it has happened. Very neat. Didn't mean I had it in me. Means she did not know that she was so perfect in all these things. Mrs. Fitzgerald said, alarmed. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald is alarmed. She is afraid. She said, but whatever shall I do? Mrs. Fitzgerald, George and the children cannot see me like this. Means this is really wrong. And how the family members, they would accept them in each other's bodies. Mrs. Pearson said grimly. Grimly means in a very sad way. She said, they are not going to. That's the point. They will have me to deal with, only they would not know it. Means Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said that her family members would have to deal with her now, and she would not come to know what was happening, what would happen to them. Mrs. Fitzgerald still alarmed. Alarmed means she was still very afraid, and she said, but what if we cannot change back? It would be terrible. This shows Mrs. Pearson's character. Mrs. Fitzgerald actually is Mrs. Pearson's character, and she said that they could, if they would not be able to change their bodies, that this would be terrible. They would be in danger. Mrs. Pearson said, here, steady, Mrs. Pearson. If you had, now look, Mrs. Pearson says, and she says Mrs. Pearson. Why? Because Mrs. Pearson is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald. And she said, Mrs. Pearson, if you had to live my life, it would be so bad. It wouldn't be so bad. You would have more fun as me than you have had as you. Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said that Mrs. Pearson would really enjoy being Mrs. Fitzgerald, because she was actually a woman with a lot of liberty and freedom, and she would not have to live a sad life like Mrs. Pearson was having. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but I don't want to be anybody else. Mrs. Pearson said, now stop worrying. It is easier changing back. I can do it anytime we want. Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, do it now. Now, this shows that Mrs. Pearson, who is actually now had become Mrs. Fitzgerald, she was very sad and she was not happy with the changing of their bodies and soul. Mrs. Pearson said. Not likely. Not likely means I am not going to do it. After a lot of hard work, they had changed their bodies, and now this time will be utilized by her. I have got to deal with your family. Means, what is the meaning? I have got to deal with your family means I am going to teach a lesson. First, that is the idea, isn't it? Didn't know how to begin with them. You said, well, I'll show you. Means you actually said that you were not able to deal with them. You did not know how to start talking to them. I will tell you how to handle your family. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, she said, but what I am going to do? Means where should I go? What should I do? Mrs. Pearson said, go into my house for a bit. Mrs. Pearson said, means Mrs. Fitzgerald said that she should go to her house, because now Mrs. Pearson had become Mrs. Fitzgerald and she should go to Mrs. Fitzgerald's house. There is nobody there. Then pop back. Pop back means come back after some time. Appear for some after some time and see how we are doing things. You ought to enjoy it. Means you will enjoy whatever would be going to happen in your house. Better get off now before one of them comes. Before anybody comes, Mrs. Fitzgerald should move out, who is actually Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald said, nervously rising, yes, I suppose that is best. You are sure it will be all right? Mrs. Pearson said, chuckling. Chuckling means she was laughing, because she was bold, and you can say she was full of confidence. She said, it will be wonderful. Now off you go. Off you go means now please go from here. Mrs. Fitzgerald said. Mrs. Fitzgerald crosses and hurries out through the door right. Left to herself, Mrs. Pearson smokes away, lighting another cigarette, and begins laying out the cards for Patience on the table. Patience is actually the name of a game, and she was actually trying to play some cards. And she was lighting the cigarette also. She was smoking, and actually Mrs. Pearson was having the soul of Mrs. Fitzgerald. That is why whatever Mrs. Fitzgerald could do, it was being done by Mrs. Pearson. She could light the cigarette, she could play cards, and she could do anything. After a few moments, Doris Pearson is actually the daughter of Mrs. Pearson. She comes bursting in left. Bursting in means she actually entered in a hurry. Suddenly, noisily, she entered. She is pretty girl. Pretty means she is beautiful. In her early 20s, who would be pleasant enough if she had not been spoiled. Means she would have been a very good girl. But because she had been spoiled, because she had some bad habits, she actually had become spoiled. Otherwise, she would have been a very good girl. Doris said, before she has taken anything in, Mom, you will have to iron my yellow silk. I must wear it tonight. Before just coming or entering the door, ushering inside the room, she started asking for a lot of things to be done by the mother. She said that the mother had promised that she would iron, means uski yellow dress ko wo press karegi, and because she had to wear it the very night. She now sees what is happening and is astounded. But when she entered the room properly, she got astounded. Astounded means she was shocked. She was really shocked, and she was surprised. Why? What are you doing? She moves down left center. Means she was asking the mother what she was doing, because she had noticed that Mrs. Pearson was playing with cards and she was smoking also. And generally Mrs. Pearson don't do this. She does not in habit of doing all these things. Mrs. Pearson now uses her ordinary voice, but her manner is not fluttering and apologetic, but cool and incisive. Generally, Mrs. Pearson was having that ordinary voice. Generally, she had a fluttering voice and apologetic voice. But this time, she would be cool and incisive, not fluttering and apologetic. Mrs. Pearson means she would not apologize. She would not be feeling sorry. She would not be speaking in a fluttering tone. Fluttering means in an indecisive or hesitating manner. Now this time she is cool and incisive. She knew how to handle. Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said, not even looking up, she said, what do you think I'm doing? Whitewashing the ceiling. Means what am I doing? Doris said, still astounded. Still she was surprised and shocked. She said, but you are smoking, Mom. Mrs. Pearson, that's right, dear. No law against it. Is there? Is there any law? Then Doris said, but I thought you did not smoke. Mrs. Pearson said, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, then you thought wrong. Doris, are we having tea in the kitchen? Mrs. Pearson, have it where you like, dear. Means you can have it wherever you want to take your tea. Doris, angrily, she became angry and she said, do you mean it is not ready? Mrs. Pearson, yours isn't. I had all I want. Might go out later and get a square meal at the Clarendon. Now, Mrs. Pearson said that she already had taken her tea and she had not, or she did not prepare any tea for Doris. And there was nothing left for her. And if she wanted, she could prepare her tea, she could make her tea herself. And at the same time, maybe Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, she would go out for a square meal. Square meal means maybe for her dinner, she would go out at Clarendon. Clarendon is the name of a restaurant. Doris said, hardly believing her ears. Who might? Means who is going out? This is page number 38. I might. Who do you think? Means I am going out. Doris said, staring at her, Mom, what is the matter with you? Mrs. Pearson, don't be silly. Doris said, indignantly. Indignantly means in anger, angrily. She was full of anger. गुस्से में बोल रही है. It is not me that's being silly, Mom. And I must say, it is a bit much when I have been working hard all day and you cannot even bother to get my tea ready. What is the meaning of bother? Bother means you are not worried about me. Did you hear what I said about my yellow silk? Means, Mom, you cannot behave like this. Do you know that I actually work hard all day long? Means I go out for work because she was doing a job. Doris was going for a job, and that is why she was actually trying to convince the mom that she was doing a lot of hard work at her workplace, and now the mother should, you can say, bother about her, and she should, you can say, iron her yellow silk dress also. Mrs. Pearson said, no, don't you like it now? I never did. Means Mrs. Pearson said that she never liked her yellow silk dress. Her yellow silk dress was the worst dress according to Mrs. Pearson, and she did not like it. Doris said indignantly again. Indignantly means she was again full of anger. Angrily she said, of course I like it and I am going to wear it tonight. So I want it ironed. Doris said that she really liked that yellow silk dress and at the same time she wanted to get it ironed because she wanted to wear it the very same night for the party. Mrs. Pearson said, want it ironed? What do you think it is going to do? Iron itself? Mrs. Pearson said that she was not ready to iron this dress, and maybe or maybe not that dress could get ironed itself. Doris said, no, you are going to iron it for me. You always do. Means this is your duty, Mom, and you always do such things for us, and you always iron my dresses. Mrs. Pearson said, well, this time I don't. Mrs. Pearson said, this time she was not ready. She is not interested in ironing. And don't talk rubbish to me about working hard. Means don't tell me that you work hard. I have a good idea how much you do, Doris Pearson. I put in twice the hours you do. This is very, very important. That according to Mrs. Pearson, she says that Doris might be she was working and she was going for a job, but more hard work, twice the work that was done by Doris Pearson was being done by Mrs. Pearson. If she was going out and doing her the hard work at her job place, but twice the hard work was being done by Mrs. Pearson at home only. She was putting a lot of work, lot of hard work, or lot of effort in doing all the household works, household chores. What are you going to wear your silk dress? Means, why are you going to wear that yellow silk dress? Where are you going? This was asked by Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald. Doris said sulkily. Sulkily means in a very bad tempered way. She said, out with Charlie Spence. Means she was going out with somebody whose name was Charlie Spence. Means maybe he was her boyfriend. Mrs. Pearson said, why? Doris, very wildly. Wildly means in a very bad way. She said, why? Why? What is the matter with you? Why shouldn't I go with Charlie Spence if he asks me and I want to? Any objections? Go on, you might as well tell me. Doris was very angry. She wildly spoke to her mother and she said that her mother had no right to ask such questions from her, and if she wanted to go with Charlie Spence, nobody could stop her. And why they were objecting? Mrs. Pearson said, severely. Severely means in a very blunt way, in a very bad way, harshly. She said, can't you find anybody better? I would not be seen dead with Charlie Spence, buck teeth and half-witted. Means she was actually making fun of her boyfriend. And she said, Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said that if she means, was Doris not able to get a better boyfriend than Charlie Spence? Because Charlie Spence was a buck teeth and half-witted. Buck teeth means his teeth were coming out of his mouth, and he was half-witted also. Half-witted means he was mad, he was crazy. So according to Mrs. Pearson, the boyfriend Charlie Spence was actually a person whose top teeth were sticking forward, coming out of the mouth, and he was half-witted also. Means he was not an intelligent boy. Doris said, he is not. Means Doris was actually opposing that he was not buck teeth and half-witted. Mrs. Pearson said, when I was your age, I would have found somebody better than Charlie Spence or given me myself up as a job. According to Mrs. Pearson, she said that if she would be in place of Doris Pearson, she would have got somebody better than Charlie Spence as her boyfriend. And if she would not have got anybody else, she would have given, you can say, this idea of having a boyfriend ever. Doris said, nearly in tears. Now, Doris was crying. She was in tears. And she said, oh, shut up. Doris runs out left. Mrs. Pearson chuckles. Why she was chuckling? Chuckles means she was laughing. She was smiling quietly and begins putting the cards together. Means she was enjoying this idea. She was treating these children as they should be. After a moment, Cyril Pearson enters left. He is the masculine counterpart. What is the meaning of masculine counterpart? Means he is the brother of Doris. If Doris was the daughter, this man, this boy, Cyril Pearson was the son. He was the brother. This is page number 39. Cyril said briskly, hello mom, tea ready? Means just before coming into the room, everybody, whenever somebody enters the room, they actually wanted to be served by mom, by mother, who is neglected, who is not given her due regard. So Cyril said briskly. Briskly means in a hurry, in a hasty way. He said, hello mom, tea ready? Mrs. Pearson, no. Cyril, moving to the table, annoyed, means he was really not happy. He said, why not? Mrs. Pearson said coolly. But Mrs. Pearson, with such confidence, she said, I couldn't bother. Means, I actually forgot. Cyril said, feeling off color or something? Means, what is wrong with you, mom? Are you fine? Are you ill? Are you sick or something? Mrs. Pearson said, never felt better in my life. Means I am feeling very better. Cyril said aggressively, what is the idea then? Mrs. Pearson, just a change. Mrs. Pearson said that she actually wanted a change in her life. Cyril said briskly. Briskly means again quickly. Well, snap out of it, mom, and get cracking. Haven't too much time. According to Cyril, the mother should get up and she should give him tea and some snacks because he was really short of time and he wanted to go out also. Cyril is about to go when Mrs. Pearson's voice checks him. Now, just before, after this, Mrs. Pearson actually checked. Checked means she actually spoke something and she interfered in between. And she said, I have plenty of time. Means you are in a hurry, but Mrs. Pearson was actually having a lot of time and she was not in a hurry. She was not in haste. Usko jaldi nahi hai. Cyril said, yes, but I haven't got a busy night tonight. Moving left to the door. Did you put my things out? Means he would have given some tasks, some work to mom in the morning to Mrs. Pearson, and now he was asking whether it was done or not. And he also again repeated that he was really busy and he had to go. Mrs. Pearson coolly, can't remember, but I doubt it. Means Mrs. Pearson said that she actually did not remember and maybe she had a doubt that she was not ready to do all these things. Cyril said, moving to the table, protesting. Now, Cyril again protested. He was again moving to the table and he said, now look, when I asked you this morning, you promised, you said you would have to look through them first in case there was any mending. But maybe Cyril had given some clothes to the mother and mother had promised in the morning that she would look after the clothes and maybe if required she would mend. Mend means she would repair the clothes. Mrs. Pearson said, yes, well, I have decided I don't like mending. But Mrs. Pearson said now she had decided, and according to her, she did not like mending at all. She did not like mending. Cyril said, that is a nice way to talk. What would happen if we all talked like that? Now, Cyril said that mother was really rudely and behaving very, you can say, in not a proper way to them. With them. And Cyril said that what would happen to the mother if all of them they would start talking insolently to the mother. Mrs. Pearson said, you all do like that. If there is something at home you don't want to do, you don't do it. If it is something at your work, you get the union to bar it. Now all that has happened is that I have joined the same movement. Now, Mrs. Pearson has said something very important. According to her, whatever these people they liked, they actually do all the things which they liked. At home, whatever they don't like, they leave it somewhere and nobody could pressurize them to do all such things. In the same way, whatever is not liked by them, at their workplace, they have the union. They have the union to support them, to bar it. Bar it means to abandon, to leave it. She said now all that has happened is that I have joined the movement. According to her, she had actually done the same thing as these people they were doing. Cyril said staggered. Cyril was staggered now. Staggered means he was really shocked and surprised. I don't get this, mom. What is going on? Means what is wrong with you, mom? Mrs. Pearson said, laconic and sinister changes. Means laconic and sinister means she actually did not want to speak. Laconic means with very less words. She said changes. Means I want to change. Doris Santos left. She is in the process of dressing and is now wearing a wrap. She looks pale and red-eyed. And then they noticed that Doris was coming back to the room. We are going to continue tomorrow from the same page, page number 39, from the last paragraph again. I hope you would have got some idea about the chapter. Please read this chapter. For any query, you can make calls. Thank you very much. Stay back home. Stay safe. Thank you.